You seek validation constantly everywhere. Seek approval endlessly from everyone. Seek acceptance perpetually in everything. Seek recognition continuously for anything. Seek appreciation chronically from all. Seek acknowledgement desperately always. Seek worth externally, never internally. Seek value outside, never inside. This seeking is destroying your power completely, destroying your confidence totally, destroying your self-respect systematically, destroying your dignity permanently, destroying your value entirely, destroying your strength continuously, destroying your independence absolutely, destroying your freedom fundamentally. That is the key. That is the pattern. That is the trap. That is the problem. That is the destruction. External validation creates dependency automatically. Dependency creates weakness inevitably. Weakness creates exploitation systematically. Vulnerability invites manipulation continuously. Neediness attracts predators naturally. But internal worth creates independence powerfully. Independence creates strength fundamentally. Strength creates power permanently. Self-sufficiency generates respect naturally. Self-validation creates freedom completely. Autonomous value establishes dignity absolutely. Internal security builds confidence progressively. Self-generated worth produces invincibility ultimately. This audiobook teaches self-worth establishment mastery, the psychology of internal validation, the neuroscience of self-value generation, the practices of self-worth building, the systems of worth independence, the methods of validation autonomy, the techniques of value self-generation, the protocols of dignity establishment. Stop seeking validation from others desperately always. Start claiming value from within powerfully consistently. Stop depending on external approval for worth. Start generating internal validation independently permanently. Stop measuring value through others' opinions constantly. Start establishing worth through self-recognition authentically. Internal worth creates freedom. Self-validation builds power. Independent value establishes dignity. Autonomous respect generates strength. Self-generated confidence produces invincibility. Beginning now. Chapter 1. You seek validation constantly. Recognize approval addiction. You seek validation constantly from everyone around you, endlessly pursuing approval in every interaction and desperately needing acceptance in all your relationships. This relentless seeking defines how you move through the world, shaping every decision you make and coloring every experience you have. You're posting on social media not to share, but to receive likes and comments that temporarily fill the void inside. You're sharing your accomplishments not from joy, but from a desperate need for someone to acknowledge that you matter, that you're worthy, that you're enough. This validation seeking manifests in specific, recognizable patterns that destroy your autonomy. Achievement broadcasting becomes your primary mode of communication, where you can't simply accomplish something without immediately announcing it to everyone who will listen, seeking that hit of external approval. Opinion fishing dominates your conversations as you constantly ask others what they think before you can trust your own judgment, unable to make even simple decisions without external confirmation. People-pleasing shapes your entire personality as you mold yourself into whatever form you think others want, sacrificing your authentic preferences and abandoning your true self in exchange for acceptance. External validation creates dependency. Internal worth creates freedom. Validate yourself or remain enslaved. The validation addiction operates like any other addiction, creating a vicious cycle that tightens its grip over time. You seek validation and briefly receive it, feeling temporarily good about yourself until the effect inevitably fades. As it fades, you need more validation, seeking it again with increasing desperation. This cycle never satisfies because external validation cannot fill an internal void. It's like trying to quench thirst by looking at pictures of water. Research by Jennifer Crocker demonstrates that external validation is genuinely addictive, providing only temporary relief while requiring increasingly larger doses to achieve the same effect. When your self-worth depends on external factors, it fluctuates wildly based on circumstances beyond your control, creating psychological instability that correlates strongly with anxiety and depression. The cost of this validation seeking is devastating. You lose your authentic self by becoming what others want rather than who you are, experience emotional volatility as your mood depends entirely on others' responses, develop dysfunctional relationships that attract controllers and manipulators, and suffer achievement paralysis as fear of disapproval prevents you from taking necessary action. Recognition requires brutal honesty about your patterns. Track when you seek validation. Identify whose approval you desperately need. Acknowledge the dependency that controls your life, and accept your current state as the necessary starting point for liberation. This recognition isn't about shame. It's about seeing the prison before you can escape it. External validation creates dependency. Internal worth creates freedom. Validate yourself or remain enslaved. You understand now that validation seeking is a destructive addiction operating through predictable patterns that steal your power and autonomy. Stop seeking approval from others as your primary source of worth, and start building the capacity to validate yourself internally, independently, and permanently. You recognize validation addiction now. Next, you must understand self-worth psychology. Chapter 2. Understand self-worth psychology, the internal value system. Self-worth is fundamentally different from what most people pursue when they seek validation from others. It's an internal assessment of your value that exists completely independent of external validation, achievements, or others' opinions. True self-worth represents an intrinsic sense of worthiness that doesn't fluctuate with circumstances, an unconditional self-acceptance that remains stable regardless of what happens around you, and a recognition of inherent value that exists simply because you exist as a human being. Understanding the distinction between self-worth and self-esteem is critical because most people confuse these concepts and end up chasing the wrong thing entirely. Self-esteem is conditional, based on your accomplishments, and dependent on constant comparison with others, fluctuating wildly with each success and failure. Self-worth, in contrast, is unconditional. It exists inherently within you, remains independent of achievement, and stays stable across all conditions and circumstances. This difference isn't merely semantic. It determines whether you build a foundation of sand that shifts with every wave or bedrock that remains solid regardless of storms. Self-worth is internal and unconditional. External validation is temporary and conditional. Build worth or seek approval forever. Research by Kristen Neff on self-compassion reveals that genuine self-worth comes from recognizing your shared humanity with all people. Everyone possesses inherent value simply by being human. Worth isn't something you earn through achievement or lose through failure. This recognition requires accepting imperfection as part of the human condition rather than evidence of your inadequacy. Understanding that flaws don't diminish your fundamental worth, and treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a struggling friend. The confusion between validation and worth creates tremendous suffering because people believe others can give them worth when only they can establish it within themselves. Validation is external and temporary, while worth is internal and permanent. Seeking worth through validation is like trying to fill a cup with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it never stays full. This misunderstanding often originates in childhood programming, where love was conditional, offered only when you performed well or achieved specific standards, teaching you that your worth depends on external approval rather than existing inherently within you. Reprogramming this deeply embedded belief system requires first recognizing the conditioning that created it, then systematically questioning every belief about worth that depends on external validation. You must establish an internal validation system that operates independently of others' opinions, building unconditional self-acceptance that remains stable regardless of circumstances or feedback. This process takes time and consistent practice, but it's the only path to genuine freedom from the validation-seeking trap that currently controls your life. Self-worth is internal and unconditional. External validation is temporary and conditional. Build worth or seek approval forever. You understand now that self-worth differs fundamentally from self-esteem through its unconditional nature and internal generation. Stop confusing external validation with internal worth and start building a self-worth system that operates independently of others' opinions, creating the stable foundation that allows you to live authentically and freely. You understand self-worth psychology now. Next, you must identify validation sources. Chapter 3. Identify validation sources. Know what you're chasing. Breaking free from validation addiction requires identifying the specific sources from which you desperately seek approval, understanding whose opinions control your emotional state, and recognizing which relationships are built on dependency rather than genuine connection. This identification reveals the invisible chains that bind you, showing you exactly where your power is being given away and to whom. Most people seek validation unconsciously, reacting automatically to specific triggers without understanding the patterns that control their behavior, making liberation impossible until these sources become visible and understood. The primary validation sources typically include parental approval, even decades into adulthood, where you're still seeking the pride and acknowledgement you didn't receive as a child. You find yourself making life decisions based on what would make your parents proud, rather than what truly serves your authentic path, continuing to chase approval from people whose opinions shouldn't control your adult life. Romantic partner validation becomes another powerful source, where you constantly need reassurance about their feelings, require their approval before making decisions, and measure your entire worth through whether they find you attractive and desirable, creating relationships built on neediness rather than genuine partnership. Know your validation sources. Understand your dependencies. Identify or remain controlled by unknown forces. Professional recognition often dominates your sense of self, as you need your boss's approval to feel competent, require colleagues' respect to feel valuable, and depend on achievement acknowledgement to feel worthy, making your entire identity contingent on workplace validation. Social media validation has created a new and particularly insidious source where likes, comments, and follower counts become the measure of your worth, leading to compulsive checking and emotional devastation when posts don't receive expected engagement. Understanding your validation hierarchy reveals which opinions devastate you most, typically those of early caregivers whose approval you never fully secured. Secondary sources include romantic partners and close friends whose opinions significantly affect your emotional state, while tertiary sources encompass acquaintances and colleagues whose opinions somewhat influence how you feel about yourself. This hierarchy shows where you're most vulnerable to manipulation and which relationships require the most urgent attention in your liberation work. For each source, asking specific questions reveals the underlying dynamics driving your validation-seeking behavior. Why does this particular person's opinion matter so much to you? What do you fear will happen if they disapprove of you? What are you trying to prove to them through your accomplishments and behavior? What childhood wound gets activated when they criticize or ignore you? What would actually happen if you genuinely didn't need their approval anymore? These questions expose the often irrational beliefs and childhood programming that keep you trapped in validation-seeking patterns, allowing you to address the root causes rather than just the symptoms of your dependency. Know your validation sources. Understand your dependencies. Identify or remain controlled by unknown forces. You understand now that specific people and situations trigger your validation-seeking behavior through patterns established in childhood and reinforced throughout your life. Stop seeking approval unconsciously from everyone and start identifying your specific validation sources, understanding why each one holds power over you, and beginning the targeted work of liberation from each dependency. You identify validation sources now. Next, you must build self-validation. Chapter 4. Build self-validation practice. Approve of yourself. Self-validation is the revolutionary act of consciously giving yourself the approval, acknowledgement, and appreciation you've been desperately seeking from others. Recognizing your own efforts without needing external confirmation and celebrating your existence independent of anyone else's opinion. This practice feels strange and uncomfortable initially because you've been programmed to believe that self-approval is arrogant or meaningless, that only external validation counts as real, but this belief keeps you trapped in dependency and prevents you from ever experiencing genuine freedom and autonomy. The self-validation protocol begins with pausing whenever you notice the urge to seek external validation, recognizing what specific approval you're craving in that moment. Are you seeking acknowledgement of your effort, appreciation of your qualities, or confirmation of your worth? Once you identify what you need, provide that validation to yourself internally by saying to yourself exactly what you wanted to hear from others. This practice initially feels less satisfying than external validation because your validation-seeking addiction is strong and demands the external hit, but self-validation builds internal strength that external approval can never provide, creating lasting security rather than temporary relief. Self-validation is internal approval practice. External seeking is dependency maintenance. Validate yourself or remain dependent. Daily acknowledgement practices build your self-validation capacity by noting 3 things you did well each day, recognizing your efforts regardless of outcomes, and appreciating yourself for trying even when results didn't match your hopes. This practice shifts your focus from seeking external recognition to developing internal recognition capacity, teaching your brain that your own approval is valuable and sufficient. Strength recognition involves regularly identifying your positive qualities, acknowledging capabilities you possess, recognizing growth you've achieved, and appreciating aspects of your character that make you valuable independent of what you accomplish or produce. Effort validation is particularly powerful because it acknowledges the difficulty of what you're attempting rather than only celebrating success. Praising yourself for trying something challenging, recognizing the courage required to face your fears, and appreciating your persistence even when progress feels slow or invisible. Emotion validation accepts your feelings as legitimate information rather than weakness, allowing yourself to feel whatever you feel without judgment or criticism, recognizing that emotions provide valuable data about your experiences and needs. Existence celebration might be the most radical form of self-validation, appreciating simply being alive, recognizing your inherent worth independent of achievement, acknowledging your unique presence in the world, and celebrating your existence regardless of productivity or accomplishment. Common obstacles to self-validation include the awkwardness of praising yourself, which feels like strange self-talk initially, and the guilt that arises from childhood programming insisting self-validation is selfish or arrogant. Overcoming these obstacles requires accepting temporary discomfort, trusting that self-validation strengthens with consistent practice, and recognizing that genuine self-validation is actually humility, acknowledging your humanity and treating yourself with the same compassion you'd offer others. Self-validation is internal approval practice. External seeking is dependency maintenance. Validate yourself or remain dependent. You understand now that self-validation is a learnable skill requiring daily practice and patience with initial discomfort. Stop waiting for others to give you the approval you need and start providing that approval to yourself consistently. building the internal validation system that creates genuine freedom and lasting security independent of external opinions or circumstances. You build self-validation now. Next, you must develop unconditional acceptance. Chapter 5. Develop unconditional self-acceptance. You are enough now. Unconditional self-acceptance means accepting yourself completely as you are right now, not despite your flaws, but including them as part of your humanity, recognizing that you are enough in this present moment without needing to fix, change, or improve anything about yourself before you deserve acceptance. This concept challenges everything you've been taught about self-improvement and conditional worth, creating cognitive dissonance because you've always believed acceptance comes after achievement, that you'll be enough once you fix your flaws, that worthiness arrives after transformation rather than existing inherently within you already. The conditional acceptance trap operates through an insidious pattern of postponing self-acceptance until you meet certain conditions, telling yourself you'll accept yourself when you achieve specific goals, fix particular flaws, or become someone different from who you are now. This conditional acceptance guarantees perpetual dissatisfaction because achieving the goal doesn't actually create acceptance. Instead, your mind immediately creates new conditions, identifies new flaws requiring fixing, and establishes new requirements before you can finally accept yourself, keeping acceptance always just beyond reach no matter what you accomplish or how much you change. Unconditional acceptance is enoughness now. Conditional acceptance is enoughness never. Accept now or chase forever. True acceptance operates without conditions, recognizing that you are acceptable exactly as you are in this moment, acknowledging you are enough without any achievement or improvement, understanding you have inherent worth despite your imperfections, accepting you are valuable with all your limitations, and knowing you are worthy including all your flaws. This acceptance doesn't mean resignation or giving up on growth. It means accepting your starting point completely before pursuing any development, creating the secure foundation from which authentic growth becomes possible. The acceptance growth paradox reveals that accepting yourself actually enables growth more effectively than rejecting yourself ever could. When you accept yourself completely, you feel secure enough to take risks without fearing that failure will destroy your worth. Develop self-compassion that permits trying new things without harsh self-criticism, and create space for authentic development driven by curiosity and interest rather than desperate attempts to fix perceived inadequacy. Research by Carl Rogers demonstrates that unconditional positive regard toward yourself enables psychological growth and authentic development, while conditional regard creates a false self designed to meet conditions rather than express genuine nature, ultimately blocking real growth and authentic self-expression. Building unconditional acceptance requires recognizing conditional thinking patterns, noticing when you tell yourself you'll accept yourself after meeting certain conditions. Challenge these conditions by questioning why acceptance requires achievement, why worth depends on improvement, why you can't be enough exactly as you are now. Practice affirming current acceptance by regularly stating that you accept yourself now as you are, that you are enough in this present moment, that you deserve acceptance without conditions. This practice feels false initially because conditional acceptance is so deeply programmed, but consistent repetition gradually rewires your internal acceptance system. Unconditional acceptance is enoughness now. Conditional acceptance is enoughness never. Accept now or chase forever. You understand now that unconditional self-acceptance means being enough now without conditions, that this acceptance enables rather than prevents growth, and that you can accept yourself completely while still pursuing development. Stop postponing acceptance until you meet conditions and start accepting yourself unconditionally right now, exactly as you are, creating the foundation from which authentic growth naturally emerges. You develop unconditional acceptance now. Next, you must establish internal standards. Chapter 6. Establish internal standards. Measure worth from within. Internal standards mean measuring your worth by values you personally hold rather than by opinions others express about you. Defining success according to what matters to you authentically rather than what society dictates. And evaluating your achievements by criteria you've consciously chosen rather than metrics imposed upon you externally. This shift from external to internal measurement represents a fundamental revolution in how you assess your value. Moving from dependency on others' evaluations to autonomous determination of your own worth based on principles and values that reflect your authentic nature rather than borrowed beliefs you've never questioned. The problem with external standards is that they rarely align with your genuine values, measuring things that don't actually matter to you while ignoring aspects of life you find deeply meaningful. Society's definitions of success often prove toxic when examined closely, prioritizing wealth accumulation over authentic relationships, status achievement over personal fulfillment, and external appearance over internal development. Comparison with others using these external standards creates perpetual inadequacy because there will always be someone more successful by conventional measures, leaving you feeling insufficient regardless of your actual accomplishments or growth. Internal standards create autonomy. External standards create dependency. Measure internally or remain controlled. Creating internal standards begins with identifying your core values by asking what genuinely matters to you rather than what you've been told should matter. Once you've identified authentic values, define what success means according to those values rather than society's definitions, establishing personal metrics that measure what you actually care about. These internal standards should focus on process rather than just outcomes, measuring your effort and integrity rather than only results, comparing your current self to your past self rather than to other people, and allowing for imperfection and humanity rather than demanding impossible perfection. Examples of internal standards illuminate this concept practically. An integrity standard asks whether you acted according to your values, maintained authenticity in your interactions, and honored your principles regardless of external pressure. An effort standard evaluates whether you tried your best with the resources and knowledge you had, showed up fully despite fear or doubt, and persisted through difficulty even when success wasn't guaranteed. A growth standard measures whether you learned from experiences, developed in some meaningful way, and became better than you were previously rather than better than someone else. These internal standards provide autonomous measurement that creates freedom from others' opinions and societal expectations. The comparison trap must be avoided vigilantly because comparing yourself to others always creates inadequacy regardless of your actual progress. Comparing yourself to imagined ideal perfection makes current reality feel insufficient, and comparing your present to an imagined future prevents satisfaction with where you are now. Internal measurement creates freedom. Freedom from others' opinions controlling your emotional state. Freedom from societal expectations dictating your path. Freedom from the comparison trap stealing your peace. Freedom from validation seeking destroying your autonomy. And freedom to define success personally according to values that genuinely matter to you. Internal standards create autonomy. External standards create dependency. Measure internally or remain controlled. You understand now that internal standards based on personal values create autonomous worth measurement independent of external opinions. Stop measuring yourself by others' standards and society's metrics, and start establishing internal standards based on your authentic values, measuring yourself by criteria that actually reflect what matters to you personally rather than what you've been told should matter. You establish internal standards now. Next, you must practice boundary setting. Chapter 7. Practice boundary setting. Protect your worth. Boundaries protect your self-worth by establishing clear limits about how others can treat you, communicating what behavior you will and won't accept in your relationships, and demonstrating through consistent enforcement that you value yourself enough to refuse mistreatment regardless of consequences. Without boundaries, your worth erodes steadily as you accept disrespect that communicates to yourself and others that you don't deserve better treatment. tolerate exploitation that reinforces beliefs about your unworthiness, and allow violations that teach people they can treat you however they want without facing any consequences. The connection between boundaries and worth is direct and undeniable. How you allow others to treat you reflects and reinforces your internal assessment of your value. Firm boundaries signal high worth by communicating that you're selective about who gets access to you, that your time and energy are valuable resources requiring respect, and that you won't accept treatment beneath your standards. Weak boundaries signal low worth by suggesting you'll accept anything from anyone, that you're grateful for whatever scraps of attention or affection people offer, and that you don't believe you deserve better treatment than whatever you're currently receiving. Boundaries protect worth. Boundary violations destroy worth. Set boundaries or sacrifice self-respect. Worth-protecting boundaries include respect boundaries that refuse to accept disrespectful behavior, require considerate treatment from everyone regardless of relationship, reject verbal abuse even from family members, and demand basic courtesy as a non-negotiable minimum. Time boundaries communicate that you're not always available to everyone for everything. Protect your personal time as valuable and necessary. Refuse to be taken for granted by people who expect constant availability and require reciprocity in relationships rather than accepting one-sided dynamics, where you give everything while receiving nothing. The boundary-setting protocol involves first identifying when a violation occurs, recognizing clearly what boundary has been crossed and by whom. Next, recognize your inherent worth independent of this relationship, reminding yourself that you deserve respect regardless of who violates your boundaries. Then communicate the boundary clearly and directly without over-explaining or apologizing, using statements like "this doesn't work for me," or "I won't accept that treatment," that establish your limit without negotiating. Enforce consequences consistently when boundaries are violated again, following through with whatever consequence you stated rather than making empty threats. Finally, be willing to lose relationships that require boundary violations to continue, understanding that relationships demanding you accept mistreatment aren't worth keeping regardless of history or emotional investment. Common obstacles to boundary setting include fear of rejection that keeps you accepting mistreatment to maintain relationships, guilt about saying no that makes you believe protecting yourself is selfish, fear of being perceived as difficult that causes you to stay easy and accommodating, and worry about seeming mean that prevents you from establishing necessary limits. Overcoming these obstacles requires recognizing that healthy boundaries are necessary rather than selfish, understanding that genuine friends respect your limits rather than demanding you sacrifice yourself, accepting that some people will leave when you establish boundaries, but those people shouldn't stay anyway, and trusting that relationships worth having survive and strengthen when you protect your worth. Boundaries protect worth. Boundary violations destroy worth. Set boundaries or sacrifice self-respect. You understand now that boundaries directly protect and reflect your self-worth through communicating what treatment you will accept. Stop accepting mistreatment to maintain relationships and start setting firm boundaries that protect your worth, enforcing consequences consistently, and being willing to lose relationships that require you to sacrifice your self-respect in order to continue. You practice boundary setting now. Next, you must challenge self-talk. Chapter 8. Challenge negative self-talk. Silence the inner critic. Negative self-talk systematically destroys your self-worth through constant internal criticism that no external enemy could match in its relentlessness and cruelty, harsh judgments about your character that ignore all evidence to the contrary, and cruel dialogue that you would never direct toward another human being, but somehow accept as appropriate for yourself. This inner critic operates automatically in the background of your consciousness, criticizing your every action, judging your every choice, catastrophizing your every mistake, comparing you unfavorably to everyone around you, predicting failure before you even try, focusing exclusively on flaws while completely ignoring strengths, and maintaining a running commentary of negativity that erodes your confidence and destroys any possibility of genuine self-acceptance. The origins of this inner critic typically trace back to internalized parental criticism that you absorbed during childhood, societal messages about your inadequacy that you've accepted as truth, and what your mind mistakenly believes is a protective mechanism. Thinking that if you criticize yourself first and harshly enough, you can protect yourself from others' judgment. This logic is fundamentally flawed because harsh self-criticism doesn't protect you from external criticism. It simply ensures you experience constant criticism regardless of what others say, creating an inescapable prison of negativity that follows you everywhere because it lives inside your own mind. Self-criticism destroys worth. Self-compassion builds worth. Choose compassion or destroy yourself. Research by Kristen Neff demonstrates conclusively that self-criticism is counterproductive to every goal people believe it serves. It doesn't motivate improvement, but instead paralyzes action through fear and shame, doesn't prevent mistakes, but actually increases them by creating anxiety that impairs performance, and doesn't protect from others' judgment, but makes you more vulnerable by destroying your internal foundation of self-acceptance. Self-compassion, in contrast, actually motivates through encouragement rather than fear, improves performance by reducing anxiety and increasing confidence, and protects from judgment by creating internal security that makes external opinions less devastating. The protocol for challenging negative self-talk begins with noticing the negative thought as it occurs, developing awareness of your inner critic's constant commentary that typically operates below conscious awareness. Once noticed, question the thought's accuracy by asking whether this harsh assessment is absolutely true or whether it represents distorted thinking, examining what evidence might contradict this negative interpretation. Challenge the distortion by identifying which cognitive distortion is operating. All-or-nothing thinking that sees only perfection or complete failure. Overgeneralization that takes one mistake as proof of permanent inadequacy. Mental filtering that focuses only on negatives while ignoring positives, or any of the many ways your mind systematically distorts reality to support negative self-assessment. Replace the harsh criticism with compassionate self-talk by asking what you would say to a close friend experiencing the same situation, then offering yourself that same compassion and understanding rather than the cruelty you typically direct inward. This practice feels strange and unnatural initially because you've been practicing self-criticism for so long that compassion feels foreign, but consistent practice gradually rewires your internal dialogue from enemy to ally, from critic to supporter, from harsh judge to compassionate friend. Self-criticism destroys worth. Self-compassion builds worth. Choose compassion or destroy yourself. You understand now that negative self-talk systematically destroys worth through constant criticism and harsh judgment that you would never direct toward others. Stop accepting cruel self-talk as normal or helpful and start challenging negative thoughts systematically, replacing harsh criticism with compassionate self-talk that builds rather than destroys your sense of worth and capability. You challenge self-talk now. Next, you must practice daily. Chapter 9. Practice self-worth daily. Build internal value system. Self-worth develops through consistent daily practice rather than through sudden insight or one-time transformation, requiring specific exercises that systematically build your internal validation capacity, strengthen your unconditional self-acceptance, and establish autonomous value independent of external opinions or validation. These practices feel awkward and artificial initially because you've spent years or decades operating from external validation, but consistent daily execution gradually rewires your worth system from external dependency to internal security, creating lasting change that transforms how you experience yourself and move through the world. 5 daily practices build self-worth systematically and progressively. Morning worth affirmation establishes your foundation each day by stating clearly to yourself that you are enough exactly as you are, that you have inherent worth independent of achievement, that your existence itself has value regardless of productivity, and that you are worthy of love and respect simply because you exist as a human being. These affirmations feel empty or false initially because they contradict years of conditional worth programming. But consistent repetition gradually shifts your internal beliefs from conditional to unconditional worth, from external to internal validation, from dependent to autonomous value. Self-worth requires daily practice. Internal value builds through training. Practice daily or remain validation dependent. Validation independence check throughout your day involves noticing each time you feel the urge to seek external validation, recognizing what specific approval you're craving in that moment, and providing that validation to yourself internally rather than seeking it from others. This practice builds your capacity for self-validation by exercising the internal validation muscle repeatedly, teaching your nervous system that self-approval is sufficient and satisfying, and gradually reducing your dependency on external validation as your internal system strengthens through consistent use and reinforcement. Boundary maintenance protects your worth by setting or enforcing at least one boundary daily that defends your value, saying at least one no that protects your time and energy, and maintaining at least one standard that preserves your dignity and self-respect. Self-compassion practice involves treating yourself kindly in at least one difficult moment during your day, speaking to yourself like you would speak to a good friend who's struggling, and offering yourself understanding and support when you make mistakes or face challenges rather than harsh criticism and judgment. Evening worth reflection closes each day by acknowledging one thing you did well regardless of outcome, recognizing one effort you made even if results didn't match hopes, appreciating one quality you possess independent of achievement, and celebrating simply being alive today, regardless of productivity or accomplishment. The progression of worth building follows predictable stages over time. The first week focuses on recognition as you notice validation-seeking patterns, identify external dependencies, recognize boundary violations, and observe self-criticism operating. Weeks 2 through 4 involve practicing alternatives by providing self-validation instead of seeking it externally, setting boundaries that protect worth, challenging negative self-talk with compassion, and accepting yourself unconditionally in present moment. Months 2 through 3 develop consistency as daily practices become increasingly habitual. Internal validation strengthens progressively, self-acceptance deepens continuously, and worth stabilizes independently of external circumstances. Months 4 through 6 achieve integration, where internal worth operates automatically. Validation seeking becomes rare rather than constant. Self-acceptance becomes your default state, and worth remains unshakable regardless of external feedback or life circumstances. Self-worth requires daily practice. Internal value builds through training. Practice daily or remain validation dependent. You understand now that self-worth develops through consistent daily practice using specific exercises that systematically build internal validation capacity and autonomous value. Stop waiting for worth to appear magically and start practicing these 5 exercises daily, building the internal value system that creates genuine freedom from validation seeking and establishes unshakable worth independent of others' opinions. You practice daily now. Finally, you must understand permanence. Chapter 10. Self-worth is permanent practice. Internal value requires daily maintenance. Self-worth is not a destination you reach and then maintain effortlessly forever, but rather an ongoing practice requiring daily maintenance and consistent attention throughout your entire life. Temporary practice creates only temporary worth that disappears when you stop practicing, while permanent practice creates permanent value that remains stable because you continue the daily work of maintaining your internal validation system, strengthening your self-acceptance, and reinforcing your autonomous worth independent of external validation or approval from others. Without daily practice, validation-seeking patterns inevitably return as your neural pathways for external validation strengthen again through use while your internal validation pathways weaken through neglect. The boundary violations you once refused to tolerate gradually become acceptable again as your standards erode without conscious maintenance. Self-criticism that you worked hard to silence starts speaking louder as compassionate self-talk fades without reinforcement. And conditional acceptance replaces the unconditional self-acceptance you developed as old programming reasserts itself when you stop actively challenging it through daily practice and conscious attention. Temporary practice creates temporary worth. Permanent practice creates permanent value. Practice daily or remain validation dependent. Neural patterns follow the principle of use it or lose it. Internal validation pathways that you've worked hard to build will weaken and eventually disappear without regular reinforcement. Self-worth circuits that create autonomous value will deteriorate without consistent activation, and self-acceptance patterns that took months to establish will vanish without ongoing maintenance through daily practice. This isn't failure or weakness, but simply how neuroplasticity operates, requiring continued use of new pathways to maintain their strength and accessibility. Daily non-negotiables maintain your self-worth permanently by establishing practices you commit to performing every single day, regardless of circumstances, feelings, or life challenges. Morning affirmation establishes your worth foundation each day before external demands and other people's expectations begin influencing your state. Validation independence throughout your day involves consistently noticing validation-seeking urges and providing self-validation instead, gradually strengthening your internal system through repeated exercise. Boundary protection maintains your dignity by refusing to accept treatment that violates your worth, enforcing consequences when boundaries are crossed, and being willing to lose relationships that require you to sacrifice self-respect. Self-compassion during difficulty means treating yourself kindly when facing challenges rather than reverting to harsh self-criticism under stress. Evening reflection acknowledges your value by recognizing effort made, appreciating qualities possessed, and celebrating existence independent of achievement or productivity. After months of consistent daily practice, a profound transformation occurs as you shift from seeking validation externally to providing validation internally, from conditional acceptance dependent on achievement to unconditional acceptance existing independent of performance, from external worth contingent on others' opinions to internal worth generated autonomously from within, and from dependent value requiring constant external confirmation to autonomous value that remains stable regardless of external circumstances or feedback. This transformation progresses through predictable stages of conscious incompetence where you're aware of validation seeking, but can't yet stop consistently. Conscious competence where you can self-validate and accept yourself, but only with deliberate effort and attention. And finally, unconscious competence where internal worth operates automatically, self-acceptance becomes your natural default state, and autonomous value functions without requiring conscious effort or deliberate practice. Temporary practice creates temporary worth. Permanent practice creates permanent value. Practice daily or remain validation dependent. You understand now that self-worth requires permanent daily practice to maintain the internal validation system, unconditional self-acceptance, and autonomous value you've worked so hard to build. Stop thinking you can develop worth temporarily and then stop practicing, and start committing to daily practice as permanent lifestyle, understanding that internal worth requires ongoing maintenance through consistent daily attention to the practices that build and preserve your freedom from validation seeking and establish unshakable worth that no external circumstance or opinion can destroy or diminish. You have learned 10 principles for self-validation. Stop seeking validation from others desperately and start validating yourself internally consistently. Stop depending on external approval for worth and start generating internal value independently. Internal worth creates freedom. Self-validation builds power. Autonomous value establishes dignity. Self-acceptance produces peace, and internal security generates strength. Beginning now, practicing daily, valuing internally forever through permanent commitment to the daily practices that build and maintain the self-worth that creates genuine freedom and lasting peace independent of external validation or others' opinions about your value and worthiness. You have learned 10 principles for self-validation. You seek validation constantly. Recognize approval addiction. Understand self-worth psychology, the internal value system. Identify validation sources. Know what you're chasing. Build self-validation practice. Approve of yourself. Develop unconditional self-acceptance. You are enough now. Establish internal standards. Measure worth from within. Practice boundary setting. Protect your worth. Challenge negative self-talk. Silence the inner critic. Practice self-worth daily. Build internal value system. Self-worth is permanent practice. Internal value requires daily maintenance. What matters now is action. Today, identify one validation source you depend on. Recognize the dependency. Provide self-validation instead. Practice one boundary protecting worth today. Challenge one negative thought. 5 daily practices starting tomorrow. Morning worth affirmation. Validation independence check. Boundary maintenance. Self-compassion practice. Evening worth reflection. Every day. Every single day. This builds worth. This creates value. Stop seeking validation from others desperately. Start validating yourself internally consistently. Stop depending on external approval for worth. Start generating internal value independently. Internal worth creates freedom. Self-validation builds power. Autonomous value establishes dignity. Self-acceptance produces peace. Internal security generates strength. Beginning now, practicing daily, valuing internally forever.